So, good evening. My name is Julian Kingston. I'm the manager of the Region of Waterloo Museums. I'd like to welcome everybody here today. And as we start, I would like to acknowledge that we are here on the Haldimand Tract, land that was granted to the Six Nations of the Grand River, and that this is also the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, Choctaw peoples who have stewarded this land since time immemorial. So I always think we should stop and think a little bit about where we are and who's here today. And today, Waterloo Region is home to a diversity of people from many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, and contribute to a thriving community that we have now. So not only is there the history of stewardship that we acknowledge, but also a thriving presence and a continuing presence that we acknowledge. Here at the region and at the museum, we do feel like land acknowledgements are important, but only something that you should do, not the only thing that you do. And programs like this that we're doing today, which take, we hope, a more careful or deeper look at things like social justice and issues around recognizing Indigenous history and Indigenous rights is something that we should be doing. So that's where we're coming from. To start us off today, we have a panel discussion, which I'm sure you all know. We're here for a panel discussion on the future of public art. And as our moderator, we have Vincent Marguet. And let me just pull out his bio so I get that all right. Just give me a second. So Fitsum is whose pronouns are he, him, is a scholar, activist, and writer who focuses on identity, state violence, and public health issues. His graduate research explores how Black and Indigenous youth resist colonialism and conquest through storytelling, placemaking, and relational practices. Fitsum's writing has been featured in publications such as The Breach Media, Canadian Dimension, Briar Patch Magazine, New Sociology, and Korea Expose. He co-founded Textile, a literary magazine and community arts collective that supports and showcases artists and writers living on the Haldimand Tract, Waterloo Region, through mentorship, publication, and curation. Ladies and gentlemen, Fitsum.
Was that the right bio that I gave you?
I think so, yeah. We talked about it beforehand.
All right. Yeah, thank you for that introduction. And I think before we start the discussion, we're going to have our panelists introduce themselves. So maybe just starting on my right.
I'm Indigenous Art. My name is Emma Smith. I am the guest curator of Dibaajimowin Stories from This Land. I am also the program coordinator for the Waterloo Indigenous Student Center. I use she/they pronouns, and I'm happy to be here to share some thoughts with you guys.
Dibaajimowin Indigenous Cause. Kuchiching Nudinjaba, Makwa Dodem. My name is Dibaajimo. I'm a Anishinaabe person, originally from Treaty 3 territory. I've been residing down here on this territory for about 16 years now, going on my 10th year in KW, so-called KW. And currently the artist in residence for the City of Kitchener and one of the co-founders of Land Back Camp. And yeah, that's about
it. So I'm Mohawk Nation Chittle Clan. I'm from the Six Nations of the Grand River, and I've lived here my entire life. My child is running around, that's Sky. And I use they, them pronouns, yes, they're Sky. And I am one of the co-founders of Land Back Camp, and I'm a sessional instructor at the University of Waterloo.
All right, let's give them a hand. So thank you for inviting me. Oh,
I have some coffee.
The elder was served.
The elder needs coffee.
Their hot beverage.
It's been a long day for you.
It's a very long day. I'm like, please bring me coffee.
So you've got your caffeine.
Yeah.
So yeah, thank you for inviting me to moderate this discussion. I'm a writer, not so much a public speaker, and left to my own devices, I will ramble, so I've got something I've written down here. So as a Black man living on this land, I think a lot about how belonging for Indigenous and Black communities in Waterloo region is impacted by the region's entrenched colonial history. The dominant narrative of this region's history is of the Mennonite settlers who cultivated the land and built the region from the ground up. Mennonite German heritage has continued to be a primary focus within local history communities and features prominently in tourism experiences like Oktoberfest and St. Jacob's Farmers Market. These historical narratives about Waterloo region omit how Mennonites, commonly described as pacifist, non-conquering immigrants, aggressively displace Indigenous peoples who are already harvesting the land by rationalizing the latter as a living impediment to agricultural progress. Waterloo region narratives also erase the history of Queens Bush settlement. Located just west of Waterloo, Queens Bush settlement was a maroon community of 1,500 to 2,000 Black freeborn men and women fleeing slavery and white racial oppression throughout the eastern half of North America. I bring up these histories because Indigenous and Black people were instrumental to the development of Waterloo region, yet their presence and history are not reflected in the region's public memory. So as someone who is painfully aware of how we continue to live in the wake of Waterloo region's violent histories and erasures, I hold an enormous amount of respect and gratitude for this exhibit. This is exactly what the region needed, an intervention that has created a space for meaningful conversations about our past, present, and future. So, to start things off, I'm going to direct my first question to you, Emma, and then I'll invite both Bangish and Amy to respond if you'd like to. So, Emma, how do you think the exhibit, which challenged the competing settler narratives of conservatism and capitalism shown visually in the murals with thoughtfully curated Indigenous voices and narratives, has impacted the region now that it's closing? Have you noticed any changes in how people envision the region's history of colonial myth-making or how Indigenous public art can intervene in and subvert enduring colonial narratives?
I think it's a great question, and I do want to start off by saying, don't worry, because we all ramble. It's just a little more acceptable when we ramble, because if you listen to Amy will say that because she's a Mohawk woman, that they ramble because of that reason. Auntie Dibaajimowin will say they ramble because of that reason, and I will say that I ramble because I'm also an academic. There are many, many, many reasons, but we all ramble, and that's the reason we get to be a panel like this today. I'm very optimistic about the future of exhibitions and art and curatorship in the region. I think it's been very well received from my experience, and I think even if it makes minor changes, like I don't know if you folks know, but back at the village there is Crucial Lodge, which is an amazing work by Clarence. And we actually brought some students from the university over to build a sweat lodge and hold an inaugural ceremony back there. And so I think being able to open up these spaces of historic sites don't necessarily need to stay preserved in a specific way. We can live and breathe and work with them as well. I think it sort of extends the same concepts outside of the exhibition and into the greater community. I think the exhibition itself, I think something I actually never got to come to the opening. I don't know if anyone knew that I was very sick at the opening, so this might also be some thoughts that I had. But I wanted to share then that you all get to experience now instead. I am very healthy and very good. One thing I really want to stress about the exhibition is that it is also very limited. There's so much that we don't get to explore. If the concept is to kind of question the narrative in the exhibition, it also needs to question the Black contributions and the immigrant contributions, second generation contributions to the region, and the stories that are held there that are really, really important. This was just a starting point, and it doesn't even cover all of the awesome Indigenous history in the region. The relationship, the settler Mennonite, or the Indigenous Mennonite relationship there is also a huge, vast history. There's so much that we don't get to touch on, and so I'm so thankful that it's been well received, and hopefully it means that this sort of work can just keep continuing to grow. Yeah, pretty much.
Thank you. No?
Do you want to add?
You're good.
Do you want to add? Me the rambler?
Right? No, I'm just thinking like, yeah, just to build on what Emma was saying, there's so many amazing stories out there, different groups, grassroots groups, organizations, Indigenous organizations, Black organizations or groups, that are doing this work that we see in the exhibit that Emma curated. Yeah, and there's a need for more spaces like this to be able to tell these stories, right? And I'm grateful, like, I guess, yeah, I'm grateful that Emma chose to work with us and to tell one story, one of many powerful stories of the work that we're doing with the Land Back Camp and these young people.
Yeah, I was just adding on to what Emma was saying as well. I think the variety of different avenues and mediums that you see in that installation, it's so limited, but it speaks to those nuances of the different types of storytelling. Like, I love the wall that looks like a basket, right? And in basket weaving, there is storytelling. There is storytelling we've woven right into baskets. There are teachings that you get while you're making the basket, right? So storytelling can look so very, very different. And I think Emma really tried to encapsulate in all of the different mediums, right? So I think the public art, it looks very different because we are very different, right? It looks very different from the murals. And I think getting to a chance to explore that in the different mediums and what we'll see next, right? Like street art, public graffiti, all of those things, I think are such a beautiful way to look at contemporary Indigenous people, Black, Indigenous, and racialized people in a good way. Yeah.
So these settler myths and narratives that sort of dominate the discourse, they're not just historical, they're also current. Can any of you comment on how Indigenous public art can subvert or challenge current day myths that are being pushed about progress and environmental stewardship?
I think we all have big thoughts on that one. My background is in fine arts, so I'm very big on public art as a communication tool. That's what really led me to this project and attracted me to it. And a lot of the work that Dibaajimowin and Land Back are both doing is the visual representation, taking up space. I think a really important thing that we don't necessarily, a concept we don't necessarily apply to that is the idea of placemaking. That if we're visually taking up space, that is like placemaking and homemaking that is happening on a larger scale, that makes it easier for youth specifically to see themselves in a given space. It's something that a lot of sort of colonial institutions like museums and art galleries are obviously much ahead of the game, but hospitals and universities, those types of spaces that are very, very strict, are able to sort of open up avenues for Indigenous youth, and not just Indigenous youth, but I think it's an important thing for all communities to see themselves in these spaces.
I think I'll let you speak for the vandalism of your art. I think it really speaks to the way people are looking at public art. But I know, speaking from what Emma was saying, like, we were in a storefront. Sty and I were featured from Dibaajimowin's photography in a storefront downtown. And it was a picture of us on a green space, just being brown and just being on the land, and it just angered people so much to see that. But Sky, right, for Sky to see themselves life-size in a storefront in the town that they were born in, and have other youth and other families message us and say, oh my God, and take pictures in front of the picture of Sky. That's important, right? That representation is important. I never thought I would see myself on anything other than like a missing persons poster. You know, that's what I thought I would see myself on the poster of, not proudly being brown and queer in a downtown storefront.
Yeah, people do not like seeing us being unapologetically Indigenous on the land, right? That makes people uncomfortable, right? That challenges that narrative that, you know, they settled here so that belongs to them, right? And not acknowledging the people who were here first, right? Who took care of this land, who are today the caretakers of this land still, you know? So, and when we started the camp in 2020, and I started taking pictures of the youth, the participants who were part of our camp, and sharing their stories with the public of what it meant to them to be a part of the camp, I wanted to take that another step further. So then I wanted to hear stories from other people in the community. So I created this exhibition called On the Land, where it's eight pictures, 8 portraits of people sitting on the land, but also answering the question, what does it mean to you to be living on this land? How does that impact you? How has that impacted the way you live today? And there's 8 very beautiful, powerful stories that people share, and you can listen to through the QR codes on the pictures that exhibit, display, ended up in the news a number of times because it was vandalized 3, 4 different times. So people did not like seeing Black, Indigenous, racialized folks sharing their stories of how they came to live in so-called Canada, and that made a lot of people upset. And the exhibit was continually vandalized. And the big question that I got was like, how do you feel about that? And I'm like, this is giving me free exposure. And it's encouraging people to come check out the exhibit and listen to the stories, right? But at the same time, I cannot say that it did not hurt me. It did not hurt me because these people took their time, to share their stories with us, with me, to pose for me, right? So to answer your question, that's one way my work has, challenged that narrative of that settler narrative, right? So and the work I continue to do through my photography.
Yeah, that's a great segue to my next question, which is actually for you, Dibaajimowin. We know that these settler colonial myths are so entrenched in a lot of the region. Maybe more so here than many other places in southwestern Ontario or further. It's very entrenched here, so it's not surprising that Indigenous youth that you support are less likely to feel a sense of belonging here, because their activism and their existence happens within and in resistance to this specific place of domination. So I'm hoping that you can speak to how your artistic practice and advocacy not only challenges these dominant narratives, but also creates space for public art that reflects Indigenous stories and perspectives, and maybe speak to the impact that this has on Indigenous youth.
Yeah, absolutely. So my background is social work. I went to school for a very long time to become a social worker, and I've worked with a lot of amazing students, like Emma, for a number of years, and then decided to pursue my hobby with photography. And the question I got asked a lot was, why are you leaving social work? And I'm like, I'm still doing social work, just in a different form. Right now I'm able to take those skills that I learned working with people, and now I'm able to use that in my photography. And I absolutely love that. I love being able to sit down with people like yourself or Amy. Amy's in all my pictures. And hear their stories, right? And it's really about creating that space where people feel comfortable with sharing just a little bit about themselves with me, right? And I absolutely love that. And to be able to take those stories and use my photography to amplify that, right? Because we don't see many spaces within the region where we get to hear those stories, right? So to be able to do that through my photography, it's an honor, I guess, for me. It's an honor to be a part of.
I know, I can feel it.
Like the last 10 minutes. But even like the young people, right? Land back camp, for them to, each of them to take their time and share a story with me that was posted with their pictures in the downtown museum and a number of art spaces over the last few years, right? And for them to provide them with a space where they can share their voice and they can find their confidence. And going into our fifth
project.
Yeah. And now these young people have found their confidence. Then we now give them the mic, right? And that's what it's all about, right? It's all about that mentorship, building them up. And it's great when we can pass the mic to them and we see them now at events. We now are saying, hey, here, you go do this thing. It's great, right, to be able to be just a small part of these journeys. And I feel like I've done that through my photography, you know, just going back to, I can't reiterate and stop saying, creating space for people to share their stories, which is so important, and that's what Emma's done too, right? Emma's been able to create this amazing exhibits where so many community members can share just a bit about themselves with us, right? And thank you, Emma, for doing that. It's a beautiful exhibit.
Not to make you cry more, but I think that, I think you're cutting yourself short a bit there. That I think your photography allows you to do that work on a larger scale, but you have always attempted to uplift youth for many years now, especially in all the roles that you've done. So I think you would do that regardless of the artistic expression that you have. But I think it does allow you to do it on a much larger scale. Like that is the reason I do the work that I do, is because you took a small res youth, pushed them into the city, and was just like, oh yeah, just come and do this thing. Actually, I got a chance. You can do it, right? Like.
I did actually. I was like, so grab your drum. You're coming with me to this queer conference, and we're gonna open it up. Emma was like, first year, not even.
Very young baby, yeah.
Yeah, baby Emma, and look at them today. So you got me crying now.
See, and I think that it really reflects how, and I think this is true for all three of you, this art isn't extractive. This public art comes out of relationship. It's a very relational approach. And you do that at the Waterloo Indigenous Student Center, and Amy, you do that as well. Maybe can you comment a little bit on how important that relationship piece is?
Oh yeah, right? Like, someone with a camera in the back of the room, you know, in some spaces, is like voyeurism. It's kind of weird, a little bit creepy kind of thing. That is not the way, clearly, that Dibaajimowin has ever done anything, right? It is about the relationship that they have, that comfort. And when you put a camera on someone and tell them that they are phenomenal, they are a phenomenal, beautiful person, something opens up with them, and they're able to capture that. And I think that's phenomenal. The trust that is built between a group of people when Dibaajimowin's in the room. Like, I'll never forget the makeup 101s. Dibaajimowin's capturing these unbelievable moments of Sky and another child who, you know, might not have had a chance to play with makeup in his family. They were playing with makeup with each other, and these just gorgeous moments when that mistrust or insecurity is not in the room because of the relationship and the space that Dibaajimowin's created. It brings out so much more in the photo, right? It's about so much more than that. That's why I let them take my picture. I don't smile well, I give the worst faces, they'll be the first one to make those jokes. But it's about that relationship that they have with us and that we have with them, and that camera that's able to like expose a little bit more of our beauty to the rest of the world. And yeah, like if you see Emma's pictures from when they were a first year student, the way that they've grown, you can tell by the color of their hair what year it was. And us, like there's 4 of us that are still the original people on the wall that Dibaajimowin had taken photos of. And that's just beautiful to see when Indigenous, Black, Indigenous, and racialized youth are empowered in those moments. And they can quickly snap a photo of it. Yeah, like Sky is one of their best models now, I think. There's a moment that they capture of pure joy that you can't get from any photographer. And they still take my picture. I take the worst pictures.
We should recreate those photos.
Oh my gosh,
Yeah.
right?
So, Amy, let's actually stick with you for a second. So you work at the university as an instructor, is that right?
Yeah, University of Waterloo.
So can you speak to the relationship between community organizing and academia in the context of public art and celebration of Indigenous histories?
Is there a relationship?
Well, yeah.
Community organizing and academia and academic research. So I did get a chance to teach a class I took in my degree in the Bachelor of Social Work, the community organizing class. Hadn't taken it since 2016, and I was given the curriculum a month before I was supposed to start teaching it. Hadn't changed much. And I realized that it was based around a lot of white organizing, historical white organizing, and a lot of based on political organizing. And I thought, wow, that just doesn't work for people, especially, and I'm sure they asked me to teach the class because I literally do community organizing. And I thought, so I had more time, I would be tweaking the heck out of this curriculum and a different textbook, all of the various things that we should be looking at when it comes to community organizing in grassroots groups, Black, Indigenous, and racialized groups, because it's not going to look the same. And I don't think there's nearly the research available. So like when I brought in guest speakers, I brought in Ground Up Waterloo, I brought in Reallocate Waterloo Region, I brought in Acting Out Waterloo Region, I brought in people working on the ground, on the front lines, to speak about how we can change what community organizing looks like. It doesn't have to look like what the white groups have been doing in the past. And the most transformational work, I think we all know, is done by Black, Indigenous, racialized, and queer people. Right? Pride didn't start as a parade. So these ideas of community organizing and just academia and academic research, they just don't match up. I think the university hires me until they figure out what I'm telling everybody in class. And then they might not hire me back again next year. I don't know if I'm teaching it again next year. Because I have a lot of things to say about how we can re-look at community organizing. Because it's not just done by white people.
I do think there's room there, like you talk about reframing, and I think that's the same thing with public art. The purpose of this exhibition, just to bring it back to that a bit, is that when there is maybe a problematic public piece of art, what do you do with it aside from just get rid of it? Aside from changing names, aside from like trying to pretend it didn't happen, how do you actually engage with that and reframe it into a way that encourages growth and learning?
For sure, yeah. So none of the academic research that I came across, right, even remotely came close to public art. Well, what would that do? You know, it's not colonial. Can we cite it all? Are we able to cite that? And you know, yeah. So I don't think that's even a discourse that has been explored enough. Because public art and activist art can change the world.
All right, you youth out there. Just saying.
I think is it Sean Wilson who talks about research as ceremony?
Research is ceremony. Their book is amazing. I would use that one for sure.
Yeah, because public art in many ways exists as an opportunity to have a conversation with community, in many ways to educate community. So when we turn to this exhibit and the themes that sort of are explored here, how do these themes and conversations contribute to larger Indigenous sovereignty and decolonization movements across Turtle Island?
I have a great one. So I got to do the last walk through the museum just before we had this talk. It's very sweet, a little melancholy, but I had a great conversation with a friend who came up. Permanentity doesn't have a ton of like work with Indigenous communities, but we've brought him to the center recently to do some work with us, and he's very like inspired and hopeful about learning. And so he came up and he said, like, you know, if you had a quick 10 seconds, like, what would you say land meant? Like, how would you describe what land is? And like the first thing that came to mind was just stories. It is that relationship and that relationality. Oral history doesn't exist as one person. Like, it has to be received. And so I thought that was just like a great kind of last moment with this exhibition.
I like to leave a little bit of the silence. Reflect on it.
Yeah, I'm just, my brain's just processing.
Can you repeat the question again?
Well, we're just, flowing and riffing here. I think something that Emma brought up that I hope maybe you two can comment on is about this specificity of land. Like, people talk about place and making space. You hear that all the time, but relationship to land and stories, that is a very Indigenous epistemology, right, of understanding the world. It has to be connected to the land. So maybe can you comment on how important it is to have that relationship to land? And maybe it be reflected in public art?
Gosh, there's so much to talk about that. Like, when I think of land too, I think of life, I think of spirit, I think of rematriation. I think of, letting her heal. I think of so many things. And I think the way that we're expressing our ideas and thoughts around land are taking up public spaces, and we're taking up public art spaces, and we're building gardens at museum spaces. So we're doing all of these things, right? Because the land is so unbelievably important. Our relationship to the land can't even be expressed in English words. As a Haudenosaunee person, you know, my relationship to the land is built into my language. It's built into my blood. When Sky was asked for the on the land piece, like how important is it for you to be living on the land? Sky was like, it was so logical, because it's my home, because this is where I live, this is where I'm from. It was so very logical to them. So I do like the fact that you're seeing Indigenous art in all of the spaces. We should be covering every space with Indigenous art. And food security. If you have a lawn, plant food. Do all of those things and take up all of those spaces, because that's art in itself too. And it's all part of healing, and healing the land. So it's a big, broad concept.
Yeah, it's great to see how, you know, since the I Don't Know More movement started like over 10 years ago, when Indigenous folks started to harness the power of social media to get the message across, right? And we realized that, hey, we can use hashtags, we can use Facebook Live, we can use Twitter. You know, we started utilizing all these different forms of communication to get our message across, right? And then now, as you know, as we year after year, we start seeing all these beautiful pieces by different Indigenous artists come forward as well too, and using their forms of art, their mediums, to tell their stories, right? To get their message across, to tell the stories of their land, their communities, their elders, right? And we're still continuing to do that today, right? Which is great. So it takes on, like, we as Indigenous people have learned to use so many different forms of art to tell those stories. And it always goes back to our homes. It always ties back to our ancestors. It always ties back to where we're from, right? Because as Indigenous peoples, that's the first thing we always ask each other, right? Oh, where are you from? Where are you from? Right? And that's such an important question for us, because we want to be able to make that connection with the person next to us, right? Maybe we're cousins, you know. I know your auntie, you know.
What's your last name?
What's your last name?
I don't think we explained it when we introduced ourselves. We used like our languages, and in that introduction, we do say exactly where we're from also.
Yeah, and that's so important, right? And we put that into our art, right? That connection, which is so important. Yeah, and I use that as well, like the On the Land series that I did, the portrait series I did with Land Back Came on the Land. That portrait series as well too, is all stories of where these people were from and what it means to them to live here. Yeah.
I'm really glad that you talked about the wide variety of Indigenous art. Can you comment on how Indigenous artists have to navigate, or often navigate, the tension between creating public art that challenges colonial narratives and creating public art that is more palatable and accepted by settler audiences? Particularly given the historical and ongoing erasure of Indigenous voices in public spaces.
People just want to see feathers and pretty flowers. I think that's what Indigenous art is a lot of times, and it's about the Indigenous person that made the art. Really, yeah, I think people really want to see that palatable. Oh, that's what Indigenous people should be drawing and painting and stuff, is like teepees and floral designs, and that's not what we're about all the time. and that's not always taken very, very well, right? There are a number of different public displays, I'm sure, that you can see that challenge that narrative that Indigenous people should just paint teepees and flowers and feathers and drums.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you see those artists out there, those performers who are now challenging that narrative of, like, you know, body shaming. Right, we're now starting to see like more Indigenous burlesque dancers, which is so beautiful, right? Because, you know, because of colonialism, because of residential school system, we have been taught those messages that we should be ashamed of our bodies, right? And that's really unfortunate that those messages keep getting passed down from generation to generation, right? We should be celebrating our bodies. That's one form of challenging that narrative, right? Digital art, right? We're starting to see that as well too. People are now starting to draw us in ways you don't usually see us, right? And that's beautiful, right? And I'm starting to move into that realm as well with my photography as well too. Why can't we see ourselves in other places? Why can't we see ourselves in other narrative, in other genres, right? We are not just traumatized people. We are more than that, right? We are storytellers, we are visionaries, we are creators, you know, we are so many things. So let's start creating that space for us to be able to do that, right?
Yeah, I think obviously like the sort of classical painting, multicultural style art is always going to be accessible. Folks love it. It's easily digestible. They can visually mark it as Indigenous. But I think it is the radical young artists right now that are like pushing what is Indigenous. I think are making these like revolutionary pieces of work. I don't know if anyone has been there to check it out, but the Hamilton Art Gallery right now has a great exhibition on radical stitch that is like a beautiful beadwork exhibition. It's tons of different how Indigenous folks are pushing the boundaries of like what is Indigenous beadwork, because beadwork itself is a really interesting marker of colonialism and globalization. You know, almost every culture in the world has a form of beadwork because it was a huge source of trade during colonization, and there are also great stories of communities in North America turning away trade because they didn't have the right color beads during the fur trade. It is a like phenomenal bit of history of how beads have changed the world, but also how urban Indigenous artists, and not just urban, but like contemporary Indigenous artists are really pushing the mold on what is considered like Indigenous art because they're Indigenous, they're doing beadwork, but they're beading a recreated Amazon bag, or they're using circuitry and using circuits as beads, and they're like just pushing the limits on this like amazing work. And if you get a chance to go see it, I highly recommend it. I think it's a great example of exactly what we're talking about here in this question. But yeah, there's definitely tons of examples of like really easy digestible works of art, particularly locally with like, I think August Swinson, Luke Swinson, Elena Jewell, they're all doing very beautiful work. And it is very visually pleasing. I think it's very easy to get caught up in like getting them into everything and overlooking maybe some newer artists or like younger artists that are like not sort of fitting the mold you're putting Indigenous art into.
Kent Monkman.
Kent Monkman.
Kent Monkman.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Go see Kent
Have
Monkman's
y'all seen Kent Monkman's work?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. I think his
I was thinking more like Dana Danger.
Dana Danger
Yeah.
too, oh my gosh,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
Adrian Stinson.
Google Dana, D-A-Y-A.
Oh yeah,
Dana.
Adrian Stinson.
Adrian Stinson.
Who works with Adrian? Lori Blondo.
Oh yeah,
Lori
Laura
Blondo.
Blondo. These are all people, all artists,
Yeah.
Indigenous artists.
Yeah.
Kent Monkman's on display at the EGO until the end of the month. If you haven't seen their work, please Google it. You know, they are one of the many artists that challenge that settler narrative. You know, like Amy was saying, everyone wants to see the feathers and, you know, the beautiful Indigenous woman sitting there.
Yeah.
And Kent Monkman's work definitely challenges that narrative of Miss Chief egotistical having an RCMP officer bent over her lap, giving him a spanky, you know, in the middle of the bush. Yeah.
Still with a very Renaissance feel to it,
Yeah.
which is very deliberate, right?
Yeah.
But they've drawn themselves into it. I love that as Miss Chief Egotistical, which is a play on the egotistical artist who always draws himself into those paintings. So if you still like Renaissance art, it still looks like that.
Yeah. Same with Dana Danger, who's a photographer and you know, artist, and they did these antlers strap-on dildos. And did these large pieces, pictures of different models wearing these antlers strap-on dildos, right? And these beaded masks, what do you call it? Like, not balaclavas, but like sexual BDSM masks,
Bondage, yeah.
bondage masks, which were completely beaded, right? Beautiful pieces. I actually saw them. Yeah, beautiful work. Check them out. Dayanna Danger.
And it's funny, like when we call it radical, like it's not even radical. Like they're just doing art. They're just being artistic. Like it's just radical from that perception. Like what do we think art is supposed to be? They're just amazing. Yeah, check everyone out that we've mentioned.
I'm thinking about local examples of Indigenous art that, stands as sort of like an intervention in these, to these sort of dominant narratives. I'm remembering when there was sort of vandalism, a banner hung over the museum downtown Kitchener. What was on that banner again?
It was the Canada flag. It was the Canada flag. It was hanging down from the museum. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and there was black paint dripping down the flag.
Right. And then what happened was that that was then taken into the museum and then turned into an installation. Some have argued that that wasn't the best way to hold that conversation or deal with this, I'll call it public art. So I guess I want to know, what are some examples of Indigenous public art or public art that is meant to sort of engender these sort of conversations that you think could be better in commemorating these histories?
Anything anything that you can see. They're not even local. Like there's not even that kind of art around here that I could name off the top of my head. Any of the installations that were put up, the 50-foot jingle dress or the Shanty Shell Dancer. That's something very cool, something we've never seen before. Those types of pieces. I love that Isaac Murdoch's work is all over the world now. You can see a water woman anywhere, and that's really fighting for everyone standing up for water. I think that's really created something huge. I can't really think of Bruno Snucky does amazing, huge murals all over Kitchener, Waterloo, and on Halls Lane as well, I think.
I don't think it needs to be huge. Like when we're talking about making change, I think the physical size isn't a requirement to make an impact. There's tons of awesome urban Indigenous youth here in KW that are all doing really great work online, with beadwork, with art. It's just sort of like encouraging them to maybe take up those physical spaces. Like I feel like there's opportunity for, I don't know if anyone knows the yarn bombing, where folks will like crochet around like a telephone pole or like a tree. I think there's always opportunity for like things like that, like something a little radical, like start us off maybe. But I don't think there's necessarily pressure to like pull in a big name and then make it maybe a publicized thing. I think there's definitely an opportunity for Indigenous youth to like do something radical and cool.
And again, it's this issue of it's art that needs to be consumed in some way for it to have value for the public, which is a problem. So how do we address that reality where Indigenous artists have to make work that, again, can be consumed because people are paying for it, it's their livelihood? What needs to happen so that they don't have to depend on making art that, meets those needs?
I think universal income.
Yeah.
Is there? I don't know if there is like a small answer to that other than like a huge systemic change, but making it accessible, making that an option. A lot of folks don't necessarily know it's an option to be able to make art for a living or to make art as they want and not for monetary gain.
Yeah, man, that's a hard question.
Well, I ask it because there are people who work at the region here,
Right.
people who hold those keys to that kind of funding,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
What do you need to tell them to get that funding,
Right.
to get those resources?
Yeah, and for me as an artist, having to spend so much of my time just going through the paperwork, like applying for grants and hoping you get the grants and, just so you can pay the bills. and then you have to make stuff with the grant and then show stuff. And it's just, it's just, why can't I just make stuff and show this my work, right, with my hands, and yeah, and I don't know, it just there's I can't think of any spaces, which is really frustrating. In this region, right, we have the Indigenous Arts Market, which is happening next month, right? But again, it goes back to we have the space down that happens twice a year for Indigenous artists. But again, it's artwork that has to be consumed and paid for and sold, and somebody's gonna stick it on the fridge, you know?
I would like to think that the Native Art Society in Toronto would be an example of a place that's making art more accessible for folks, particularly folks who are precariously sheltered and don't have a place to store their art. So people can go in and like make art, and you can store it there and come back for it later on and work on it later. They have supplies. It's a phenomenal amount of work for a lot of people. I'm sure they do a lot of fundraising. They had to raise a lot of money to get a space in downtown Toronto, but they feature works of art that you wouldn't normally see because it's somebody that lives in their car, right? So I think that type of space, yeah, Waterloo region, hey, we need like an arts collective space that will allow for marginalized folks, for folks that are lower income, for folks that don't have access to art supplies, for folks that don't have access to anything, a camera, you know, to, and then store their art, right? Like we need to make that more accessible, and I think Native Art Society might be a good example of some like downtown Toronto thing that could be done here.
There are like tons of great examples in Turtle Island that are of artist residencies that the sort of like only requirement or trade, like you're not having to create something for a show, you're not having to create something for a specific purpose, you're just creating to create and hopefully leaving something in the space, like to build their collection for different works that are very interestingly set up.
For sure, yeah, like I think the point of these are like, it doesn't have to be sold. You know, it's not going to be in all of those spaces where people are like consuming it. And it's all about the dollar, right? It's going to be in spaces where people like want art and want to see great art.
One of the pieces that we included in our vision document when we started advocating for a downtown Indigenous Community Center was the part of the building dedicated to an art space. So we can have, you know, a space for rotating art where people don't have to sell it, they could just show it off.
They could just show it,
They
yeah.
could just show it off, right? Because again, we call out, there are no places for us to show art. You know, there are very few places, right? And if there are, there's so many conversations and so much work that has to be done just to show a piece, you know, which is really unfortunate. You know, I've been there, and there's a lot of emails and conversations involved in grant applications just to have a piece hanging up, right? Why can't we just have a space that we can have our own autonomy over, our own control, and decide whose artwork goes in that space, right?
Yeah.
I was just going to say, I think museums and galleries are built that way though, right? They're actually built that way. They're designed in a way to bring in a certain demographic of people and a certain, flavor of people, but it's actually designed that way. So I love the idea of getting away from that whole colonial narrative of if it belongs on the wall, it means it's valuable. If it goes up on the wall, it means it's valuable. And to what people that are consuming it. So challenging that narrative of museum and art gallery spaces.
Yeah, I really feel like it comes down to political will, right? Like, who has the will to actually place that value on the arts? And, you know, now we see councillors, politicians wringing their hands. You know, where will we find the resources? You know, it's not like there's a surplus
The
anywhere.
police budget, I think, has some money they could take away.
It's not like there's a surplus in the police budget. We won't get into that. We can move on. I want to get into the Queen Victoria statue. So, conversations about that statue were happening around the same time the exhibit was showing. And these two things happening in parallel, I think, was really interesting because here we have a piece of public art in the park that many people are saying is harmful. And then we have this exhibition, which is countering all those myths and narratives that get enshrined in this region. So I want to know your thoughts on the whole controversy around the statue, and what role you see critical public art playing in that situation.
So I really wanted to bring this question. When we were kind of like opening the exhibition, and I think even as early as like when we were setting up, everything going on in Willow River Park was happening, and the conversations were happening. And we were really reflecting on why this exhibition was coming to be. So it was Adrian Becker and a group of folks were at the Regional Waterloo building in the cafeteria, and these murals were just sitting in the cafeteria. Like people were eating spaghetti next to these like murals, which are historic artifacts. And so one, they weren't being preserved, and two, you know, they were still being displayed in a way that suggested it was an accurate history. It was labeled our region's history. When the bank closed down, they were just kind of given to the region. And even though being commissioned for a bank, they were obviously leading up to the final bit of history being industry and growth and money and capitalism, that's not necessarily where we would all say our lives are going toward, or our stories are going toward. And so how, you know, it was a conversation of like, how do we, obviously these are inaccurate, how do we take them down and not just hide it away and pretend it doesn't exist, but how do we engage with it and work with it and build out this larger story to acknowledge that these are not accurate murals, that they don't accurately tell the region's history, but also in a way that acknowledges people who do love these murals. They were held up in the region for decades. How do we acknowledge those folks without sort of combating them in a way? And I think the same thing with the mural. Obviously, folks are like against taking it down. I don't agree with that. I think it's obviously not like not a story that we need to keep telling. But you know, that doesn't mean there's not a solution, a public art solution to displaying a different narrative that in some way acknowledges the fact that there was something there. I think that's always a very viable option. Yeah.
No.
What do I think of the Queen statue stuff? Yeah, you know, I was part of those conversations when the black paint was on that Canada flag outside the museum. I remember they had this whole public discussion and they brought everybody in. But then they started it with the police, right? They went off on a very, very vandalism and cops mentality. They didn't start in a good way, like we're gonna have an open discussion about it. Like the cops were there and they spoke first and they were in uniform. So they had already controlled the narrative around what we were gonna talk about, like a public art piece. They already controlled the narrative. So I think these conversations definitely have to be had. They have to be had. There are so many people that didn't even know the Queen was in the park. Like, people aren't visiting green spaces or the park in particular, I don't think, to visit the Queen, to learn about history. They didn't even know she was there. People didn't even know she was there. So I think there's just like conversations that need to be had about them. What are we using our green spaces for? Who uses green spaces? Come on, let's be honest. I think we know that it is not always affluent, rich white people because they have green spaces in their homes, like in their backyards. So I think we should be looking at what types of art are in public spaces, what conversations that are being had around it. And for me, proportionately, right, I don't have grandparents. My grandfather, you know, residential schools, all of the things that the Queen had a hand in, a major hand in, I'm not sure compares to some other things. So I think the type of art that we're having in public spaces, why it's there, yeah, we absolutely should acknowledge the atrocities, but we don't put up statues of Hitler. Right? We're taking Ryerson down, we're taking Sir Johnny down. So I think we should have conversations about that, tell the full story though, tell the real story. And do we really need to see her today? You can go to where you need to go, museums, art galleries, schools, institutions to see that, I think. It's important to remember who's being affected and who's traumatized. in green spaces by that type of art.
I didn't know how to follow that. Yeah, I was just thinking about like, you know, the concept of people being uncomfortable, you know, with like these pieces that Emma brought in, that set the colonialism stories, and then telling the narrative of like, what is the real history of this land, right? It's not just that separate colonial piece, what is the real stories of this territory, the Holman tract, you know, and then how, you know, the vandalism with my installation on the land, you know, making people uncomfortable. But then again, also having that conversation, that's starting the conversation, or that question being come up, like, why is this making people uncomfortable, right? Why is it uncomfortable for black paint to be poured on a Canadian flag during Canada 150? Why does it make you uncomfortable that somebody had poured paint on the Queen Victoria statue, right? What is it? What about it is making you uncomfortable, right? And the thing that we heard a lot on, or we read a lot online was, you know, she's a educational piece, and I'm like, I don't see buses. I don't see buses of children, school trips going up there every day, you know, to learn about Queen Victoria. You have this little device in your hand that you can.
The internet is still
the internet is still, you know, you can take it down. You're still going to learn about Queen Victoria. So I don't know. It's just, I'm just saying that, you know, to going back to just that uncomfortable piece. To when you are uncomfortable, why? What is it? What is it about that piece of art that's making you uncomfortable?
There's a great line that one of our mutual friends used to say, and I don't recall her name right now, but they used to say, it's unsettling to think of yourself as a settler.
Yeah.
And I always think that's a great line.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like that one. That's still up. So if the statue doesn't come down, what new public art could transform that space that still is reflective of these histories? If you could put up anything, what would you put up?
Do like a huge huge First Nations Métis Inuit call out for artists to do huge mural space, walking space. Oh my gosh, so
Or
many
murals, maybe surrounding, blocking off.
things. It's perfect.
Offsetting.
You can't even see her.
That was a question actually that came up during the.
What would we want to
Yeah, what would we want to see at the statue? Like there, during the first consultation meeting with the community around the conversation of the statue was, would you want to see some art around it to cover it? Or would you want to see take it down and have art replace it? Or yeah, you know, those are some of the questions we asked.
Well, one of our friends actually said, so like if we take the statue down, because nobody likes the red paint, fine, we take that all the way, but they're an Indigenous artist, what if they put up a statue with red paint on it? How is that not Indigenous art? That would still be an Indigenous art piece, right? So really countering that by saying that could be art as well. But the red paint was a statement, right? That conversation that needs to be had about why it's so uncomfortable.
How much time do we have left? Can you?
We've got to give 15 minutes.
All right.
Depends on how much time we want to hold for questions.
Yeah.
Okay.
How many questions?
Yeah, you know what, actually, I've got a final question about your piece, Dibaajimowin, but I'll hold that and maybe open it to the audience. Does anyone have any questions for our panelists about public art, about their practice? Yes, in the purple shirt.
With the Queen Victoria statue, and we're decolonizing the space, I think it's gonna go. But what do you guys think about the idea of the permanence of an installation? Is that a dead idea, or is that something that we can still use in our culture going forward? You know, something that's made of granite and metal that stays there. have we outgrown that as an art form, or is that still something that we can use as a culture?
I think it's a bit of a twofold question. I think in this very specific instance, I think the solution isn't just replacing. I don't think the solution is like, let's just take away our thing and put your thing in the place. Like now that's your thing. I think it is redesigning into something that like reflects more of the like group accurate sort of like representation of some sort. But I do think almost we've grown away from the idea of permanent installations. I think that's maybe like a sticky point, perhaps, because I think anytime you have shifting art, that there are folks, it's hard to like still respect the artists that have done that work and still to give space for new artists. But when it comes to like murals and public art, there is almost like a limited space. If they're all permanent pieces, there's only so much space we can do, and we always want to be thinking, I think as Indigenous folks even, we always want to be thinking about the future generations and how far something's going to reflect the accurate telling of now into the future, but also, you know, that 7 generations like reflecting back and forth. So I personally think we're evolved past the need of permanent installation pieces. I don't have a solution for it, but that's my opinion. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I'm not an artist by any means whatsoever. I'm not creative at all. But I like the idea of that, like sort of getting away from that ornate pedestal statue type thing in the park to something more natural, something that is not harming the space on a permanent basis, something that can be renatured back into the land if nobody was here. A garden, something that's sustainable, something that is green, greener than rocks on the land, that market's place kind of thing. Yeah, I like, but I think of the impermanence of Indigenous people and the forced relocations of Indigenous people. So to me, I see an impermanence as being, we're always here. We're always here. And I don't want to feel like that's, relocating us. But the idea of having different pieces as well is wonderful and beautiful, and that would change and evolve right from my child or my 23-year-old and their child, right? Because they're at OCAD, so that could be an idea for that sort of a future generation thing, that it's not permanent rock pedestal on the ground.
Yeah, definitely an educational opportunity. We've seen the comments, we've heard the discussions in person at these consultation meetings about the statue, about, she was a great person, she did so much for Canada. What about everything else that she did? There's so much that's being left out, that we're not talking about. So if we're gonna have that conversation about the statue, let's have the conversation about the whole history of why she was there and her role. Let's not just talk about the one piece that we want to hear about, the good stuff. And that's as far as the conversation got, right? It was supposed to be 3 different sessions with the community. It only ended up being 1. And then...
Why did it stop? Do you know why it stopped?
That's a whole other...
I don't think get it all.
That's a whole other evening.
The consultant completed their work and the report was given over.
And there was a report, and that was it. There is an installation right now at Conrad Grable.
Yes.
That's focusing around graffiti, the conversation around graffiti, and there's apparently a piece that they put a big giant cardboard cutout of the statue covered in paint, which I haven't seen yet. So go to Conrad Grable and check it out.
There is something, if I'm going to comment on the question, about the desire for that permanence that reflects a sort of like colonial desire, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like this need to have something that lasts forever on land, as opposed to something that reflects the ever-changing relationship we have to land. Anyway, that's just my personal thoughts. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to go back to an earlier part where you were talking about oral history and land. And I'd like to be able to understand better what that space needs to be able to continue in a permanent way the oral histories that need to happen on this space, in this land here.
Oral history is always going to happen. It always has happened. I think youth and colonization, a lot of stories have maintained and stayed. There's a lot of knowledge now being shared from historic oral stories with scientists and academics that's creating a really kind of like interesting field right now. But in terms of like actual space, a large part of the exhibition was you know, if we're talking about oral history, like where does that happen? Where does it happen now? If we want to represent that, is it just kind of like around a fire and like that sort of thing? But rather instead, it is like where has it happened? I think in the past, 40, 50 years, it's happened at your grandma's kitchen table. It's happened when you're out having a picnic, having a coffee in a park with a friend. It's that sharing of stories in a generational way. Like, I think everyone can experience that of you sitting down with your aunt or I always kind of go up the matrilineal way of like aunt or grandmother, but sitting down with an older relative and they kind of like share a bit about themselves, something new, something you have never heard, and you get a little more insight into their life and your relationship changes. It's that relationality with another person that makes us who we are. And so those oral histories are always going to stay. It's just that when it's shared in community, like these spaces that it happens, there is like a fire in there that still represents land back without trying to shift it into that historic context, but rather how it happens now with a TV screen and like these modern things. But yeah, these will happen, and it's less of like designating a physical space, but making space for it, like in everyday life.
I think that was my favorite part actually that is actually my favorite part of the exhibit is the kitchen, because it reminds me of my kitchen growing up on the reserve and the many, many nights I sat around with my grandfather who would talk to me in the language, sitting around the kitchen table with my aunties, watching them jig while my grandpa played the fiddle, right? So that kitchen brought back a lot of memories. Just building on what Emma said, and now with the work that we do today, to continue creating those spaces around the monthly fires, the monthly drum circles that we have with our youth, to be able to sit down and have conversations with knowledge keepers like Kathy Absalon, right? To be able to just have that safe space where they can just be unapologetically Indigenous, right? And have that knowledge transfer happen.
I'm good.
I will say, I think about Edouard Glissant and this right to opacity, right? Like where does that need to want to have access to certain oral histories or stories come from? Do we have a right to it? I think some things, some people and some stories have a right to be unknown, unmeasured, So yeah, just a little bit of a pushback on that. Not everything has to be known, right? So yeah. Oh, are we good for time? Can we take a?
Yeah, we're good.
No, okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just curious from each of your perspectives how you see how artists can best utilize storytelling, placemaking to help showcase our differences and, dare I say, highlight our differences as a means to create empathy and maybe some more understanding.
My immediate thoughts go to, I would call it positionality, which is maybe a bit academic speaking, but it is sort of like entering into a space or presenting your work there is no like objective artist, there is no objective author. Your personal influence will always have something represented in your work, and being forthcoming and outright about that right away. Introducing yourself, where you're from, those sort of things, like right away in your work, is an act of positionality. methodology, I suppose, of creating and presenting. I think maybe an easier way to say that is just that, yeah, there is no objective author. You will be reflected in your work, and if you're outright forthcoming with that, it'll be well received and it'll be authentic.
I think, I don't know if you're asking personally for you, personally as an artist, like generally.
Generally.
Yeah, like Indigenous people should be telling their own stories. Like I don't know what context this question might be or example or what, if an artist is having, is wanting to tell stories of the land, and Indigenous people can do that, right? Indigenous people have to be able to tell their own stories. We are the author of our own stories. So I think as artists or whatever, that needs to happen. People have to tell their own stories. And I think that narrative that's created sometimes by other people and wanting to tell someone's story, we have to take that back into our own, right? Those are our own stories to tell. So I think we have to empower and amplify voices that are not historically heard, but by simply letting them tell their own stories, by simply letting them do what they need to do, and in whatever form they need to tell their own stories, because that's another thing that we're not always allowed to tell our own stories in our own ways as well.
For non-Indigenous artists, to build on what Emma was talking about, around positionality, your social position, interrogating your histories and the histories of people in your lives, and being brutally honest about it, I think is a really good way to tell your stories, to be uncomfortable. I think a great example of it, and he's going to hate that I do this, but Jeff Martin, a local author, does a great job of that, challenging Mennonite histories, his own histories, and putting that in context. How does this relate to or complicate your own narrative? I think digging into that and being really forthright is a good way to share those stories.
Oh yeah, gosh, we made a film even. We told them.
We made 2 films.
We told the whole story in a film. And that again was someone came to us, offered their skill as a videographer, video person, and gave us free rein. I didn't know I was a filmmaker. I've never done anything like that before in my life. But the ability to simply do what we needed to do to tell our own stories was phenomenal. It's been screened at 13 film festivals across Turtle Island, including Imaginative, which is like Indigenous filmmaker goals. And that, just that festival alone, the ability for us to tell our own stories is phenomenal. And we made 2 films actually. And that again, though, was telling someone else's story. So we let people tell their own stories, right? It was 32 interviews with folks across Waterloo region, and they told their own stories. I think it was edited just for time, but we still put the full conversations on YouTube so that people could see the full story. We just captured a tiny little bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and working with someone like Eric, as a white male cis settler, who came to us, and has been a big supporter of the camp from day one. But we worked with him on both films, but he just, he shot it and he let us, tell the narrative, right? And it was great to be a part of this whole process with him.
And we didn't even consider doing anything like that until we had spent like the whole summer with them. We built a relationship with them. They came and hung out with us, right? Without the camera, without the notepad. So we built a big relationship with her to this day. So I think that was part of it too, is that they didn't just come to want to do a story and to take pictures of us or to make a film.
Yeah, and he hasn't used it as an opportunity to, take the spotlight from us. He used it as an opportunity for us.
Yeah, he's even like declined not being like on stage or not doing things because he wanted the spotlight on the people telling the stories.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
He takes a very relational approach,
Yeah.
right? It's
Absolutely.
like the relationship is the most important part
Yeah.
of the whole process.
Yeah, and I feel like for folks, you folks, you can also do that, right, in your spaces as well, and ask yourself that question, like, how can I do that in my work to amplify the Indigenous voices throughout the region, right? How can I do that in my space without taking that spotlight or the mic from them, right?
Do we have time for more questions, or are we, is the curtains closed?
I don't like to be the guy that rushes. Last time I tried to end one of these panels on time, I got in trouble from my boss.
Okay.
I
Well,
have
then-
permission to continue.
Okay.
This is how we like to do things. So if there's something you want to do, you want to talk about it front to wrap things up? Or
Yeah, I think to wrap things up.
the indulgence of the audience on time.
Yeah, Bangishma, I'll ask you my closing question. Can you tell us a little bit about the current piece that has just gone up? So we have an exhibit that's closing, but now we have your piece that's now showing. Wewa, is that? Wewa.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about that piece?
Oh, I'm like, what are you doing? I'm like, give me some skin. Doing the awkward old person high five. Oh man, I'm tired. The Wewa. Thank you to the Kensington Museum for creating this space to show this beautiful piece of beadwork. Donna Noah could not make it today, unfortunately. She's been a dear friend for many years who resides in London, Oneida, and unfortunately came down with COVID. They have COVID, and we're so excited to have them here tonight. Donna made this for me I commissioned Donna to make it for me about, 8 years ago, something like that. It's been to about 12 different countries with me, 14 different countries with me. It's been a conversational piece. Wewa, if you don't know who Wewa is really has become almost like an icon in the Two-Spirit community. If you were to look at a lot of older books that around Indigenous queer folks, you would automatically see a picture of Wewa, who is a member of the Zuni tribe. There's a lot of research written about her, the work that she did, the advocacy work she did with her people, as a Two-Spirit person, trans person, and she was a weaver, pottery maker. She was a mediator for her people. She was so many things. She did so many roles. And she befriended the researchers, and they became really good friends. So there's a lot of stories written about her. But she was respected for who she was as a trans person, and it was never questioned, right? Because that's who we were before, residential schools, before colonialism. We were just ourselves. Like we were just Indigenous queer people without being questioned, right? So today you'll see Wewa's picture in a lot of books and magazines and stuff. So Wewa was the first image that I saw as a kid in a book that was gifted to me when I was 13 years old. And she's just a reminder when I was a kid that there's people like me. I can start crying. So I worked on this series of beadwork pictures, and Wewa was one of them. And so today, Wewa is a reminder. If you read the little placard in front of the picture, she's in a bushel of forget-me-nots, as a reminder that we have always been here since time immemorial. Indigenous queer people we've always been a part of our communities, our nations. We have so much to give and continue to give back to our communities. You now see so much of us in so many circles. We are now part of these circles again, right? You see our youth, our Two-Spirit youth, taking to the circle at the powwow, wearing the regalia that they want to wear, and they should not be questioned, right, of what they want to wear. I created the picture during the camp.
For the series.
And it was, again, it's just a reminder to everybody that there's so much work that needs to be done in creating space for Indigenous queer people, And that's the work that, you know, we continue to do as Indigenous queer people ourselves. So, yeah, I just really want to say thank you to the Kinsey Museum for showing this piece. And shout out, thank you to Donna Noah for allowing me to share your beadwork with the world, because it literally has visited many countries with me. So
Where is it hanging?
it's just hanging around the corner.
Just hanging.
Yeah. So yeah, that's it. Be rich.
Well, on that note, I want to thank you, you three for being here and speaking and sharing your thoughts and your stories and insights on this exhibition. And yeah, please give it up.